Today we're going to be talking a little more about variation and speciation. And this is in your book on pages 44 through 47. And this picks up with some of our notes that we were doing before. So this is the bottom of 44 through 47. Variation, we mentioned with talking about Darwin, because variation is that a single species can have a wide amount of variation and still be an interbreeding species. So maybe you remember these snails that we worked on identifying a couple times ago. All of these snails are actually the same species in this picture, and this was one of the types of snails that you worked at identifying. All populations have variation, and we just need to look for it. And we're going to look more closely for variation in a lab that we're going to do when we have some in-person time. But when we're talking about a species, we've been talking about populations that interbreed naturally and have fertile offspring. Sometimes it's hard to say where one species ends and where the next begins. It's kind of blurry. So where do we draw the line? So if we have a population of frogs that gets divided by a freeway, it could prevent them from interbreeding. But would they be a different species? Probably not at this moment. Maybe they'll find a way over this highway. Maybe concerned citizens will build a bridge over the highway for wildlife or a tunnel. But how distantly separated do they have to be before we draw the line? It's a tough question. What about organisms that are asexual? If they don't interbreed, like bacteria don't interbreed, how can we classify them as a species? Or what about organisms that occasionally form hybrids? A hybrid is when two different species actually reproduce and have offspring, like these crows, carrion crows and hooded crows, can actually successfully have babies, and sometimes these babies can be fertile. But if they don't reproduce very often, should we still consider the carrion crow and the hooded crow to be different species? Now, most of these cases are determined on an individual basis. They will look at DNA, they will look at appearance, they will look at behaviors, they will make the best decision with the evidence that they have. But what about when we don't even have a lot of evidence? Like, what if we have organisms from different time periods? We could talk about fossils, and we can talk about different species of dinosaurs or other prehistoric life. How would we know if fossils would have interbred? Like these trilobites from different ages. What if trilobite A is 310 million years old and trilobite D is 300 million years old? How would we ever know if they would have interbred? Not only do we just have fossils, but now we've also got these things separated by time. Like we don't even have behaviors. We don't have DNA. So hopefully you can see that this is a harder question than you might have originally expected. Kind of like the question about, is something alive? It's harder to make a definition than you would think. So scientists make the best determination based on the evidence that they have. And with new evidence, sometimes the defined species can change. But us changing the definition of a species based on new evidence is different than a truly new species arising. So that's what we're talking about now. When two groups of organisms are different enough that they no longer naturally interbreed and produce fertile offspring, then we have a new species. This is called speciation. So speciation is going to be an important part of evolution, that when differences become enough that they no longer interbreed, we have a new species, which is what Darwin has been talking about. His book was called On the Origin of Species. So how do we get speciation to happen? Usually this is a result of populations being isolated from a period of time. As they are isolated from each other, differences build up between them. And then, even if they get to come back together, they no longer interbreed. Maybe they no longer sing the same song or have the same mating dance, or maybe they no longer reproduce at the same time. Like maybe one plant flowers in May and the other one flowers in July. So if they no longer can reproduce, then they are a separate species. So let's see an example of how speciation might work using some real data from a study in California involving salamanders. So a little bit of background about salamanders. There's a group of salamanders in the genus Ensatina, and they are strictly terrestrial salamanders, meaning they don't have any of their life cycle totally in water. They do need a moist environment, though. They don't thrive in very dry conditions. So, this species of salamander has been studied by a researcher at UC Berkeley, and this is all based on his data. So, we're going to have a map of California and where these salamanders have been identified, and we're going to work on answering some questions. And you're going to answer these questions using your Edpuzzle questions that are going to pop up as we go. And just try your best on the questions. I'll make sure you have all the correct answers to fill into your book. So for part A, we're going to look at a map, and I want you to see, is the species uniformly distributed, and does the species seem more characteristic of mountain areas or of valley areas? So here is our map of California, and every colored dot that you see is a place that they have found salamanders. So looking at our map, hopefully you saw that the species was not uniformly distributed because there weren't any salamanders in the center. And does the species seem more characteristic of mountain areas or of valley areas? The salamanders were in the mountains, not in the valleys. If you know anything about California, that central part of California is valley, and it is drier. So that makes sense based on what we know about these salamanders. Now, we've got some subspecies of salamanders in California. Do we expect any pattern in the distribution of subspecies? Why or why not? Now remember, a subspecies is a population within a species that's isolated and doesn't interbreed often with the rest. So we talked about subspecies the other day when we had the tiger example. So for example, Siberian tigers and Bengal tigers are both tigers. They're in the same species, but they're different subspecies. And maybe you remember that the Siberian tigers look very different than Bengal tigers, but they can all interbreed and produce fertile offspring, so they're part of the same species. So what about these salamanders? Do we expect any pattern in the distribution of subspecies? So there will be a pattern in the subspecies because closer subspecies are going to be more likely to breed with one another, so they'll probably look more alike. Closer you are, the more similar they're going to look. Hopefully that makes sense. So now we're going to look at a map, and the different salamanders are going to have pictures next to them. Each color square on the map shows where that type of salamander has been found. And you want to see, does there seem to be any order in the way these color patterns occur in California? So here's our map, and like the green dots are all about this E. platensis salamander, which you can see it has green next to it in the parentheses. So that's saying that that salamander was found on green, compared to the orange salamander is G. So take a moment to look at our map. So what was the color pattern? The salamanders with a red background are along the coast, and salamanders with dark bodies and colorful spots are along the inland mountains. Now we're going to look at specimen B and C on the map. B is the red squares, C is the blue. What relationship is there between their distribution? In other words, where are they in relationship to each other on the map? So hopefully you see that B and C are both in Southern California and they are right next to each other in the area. Now, you might wonder if there are salamanders in places that we don't have any information on our map. You might also wonder if there are other subspecies besides the colors that are already on the map. So, what would we do? We would collect more data. So, our researcher, Stebbins, has collected more data and we've added this information to our map. So, now you can see that there is extra information. They went along the valley in the central part of California, and all of those navy blue trimmed in gold areas are places that they looked and looked and found no salamanders. There are definitely no salamanders in parts of California, just too dry in some of these areas. So you can also see that we have some additional squares colored in. And we have some new colors as well, some new populations. So, according to the researcher, the unidentified populations are not additional subspecies. What's the probable relationship of populations 8, 9, and 11 to the subspecies plotted on the map? And I'll say focus especially on this unidentified population number 9. I think that one is going to help you answer this question the most. So look at that burgundy color there that is on the map and the picture of unidentified population number 9. And it's not a separate subspecies, but how did we get this salamander? So these unidentified populations are a mixture of the neighboring subspecies. They're hybrids. So for that number 9 that I pointed out, it has orange spots like F and yellow spots like A, which are its neighbors. So A and F subspecies reproduced and had this salamander number 9. Now, using this idea of hybrids, think about what you would expect specimens of population 11 to have. There is no picture of population on our map, but we can see where it was found and you can see who its neighbors are. So I want you to hypothesize what it would look like. So there's population 11 in that teal aqua color. Decide what you expect it to look like. So population 11 would have a reddish background color with some black striping up its sides. A little bit more than the one to its south, a little bit less to than the one to its north. And that's what they have found. Now, another question of subspecies. Why is it unlikely that you would find individuals combining characteristics of the EE picta, which is yellow, on the map, and EE xanthoptica, which is orange on the map? So here's our map again. Look at yellow, look at orange. Why do we not expect them to have a hybrid? They are too far away from each other, and there's another subspecies between them as well, so it's super unlikely that a salamander would travel all that way and ignore other potential mates. So we're not going to end up with a hybrid between that yellow population and the orange population. Now, let's look again at B and C. When the researchers went out to collect more information, they went down there and collected additional specimens from the area. Why? What reasons were there for trying to collect additional specimens? And how do the results of those additional collections differ from other places? So here's our map again, and you can see down there where there is red and there is blue, the B and the C, and there are additional collection sites. So why and what's different? So the reasons were to see if the subspecies share the same area. They wanted to see if they could find any hybrids between them, if they really were totally overlapping, and they were. If you notice that there were some squares that had, like a blue square that had red dots in it, that means that originally blue salamanders were found there, and then red salamanders were found in the exact same square. And vice versa. There were some red squares with blue dots in them, meaning that they originally found the red kind of salamanders, and now they've also found the blue. So these subspecies share the same locations. And the difference is we're not finding any hybrids. The different subspecies are in the exact same locations. Now, remember our definition of a species, that organisms will naturally interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Think about the locations of populations on the map. Which one of these populations could be, and even once was, identified as a separate species from the E. escoltsi, which is shown in red? Those blue ones, the clawberry, were once considered a separate species because they're in the same place as the red and they are not interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. Now, imagine that you find a new specimen, and this is what it looks like. This little guy, unidentified population number 10. Between which two populations is this specimen most likely a hybrid? Now I've added him to the lower left of our map just so that you can compare without having to pause the video and going back. So here we have unidentified population number 10. Look carefully, and who is this a hybrid between? It's most likely a hybrid between A and C. Notice those dark background colors, the yellow spots, and there's a continuous band across its neck, like C. So A had the yellow spots, C had that continuous band. Now, why did our researcher that we've gotten all this data from, Stebbins, why did he conclude that there is only one species of Ensatina in California? Because each population reproduces with its neighbor, except B and C. But if we look, there's a continuous ring, or at least a U shape, like an upside down U, I guess a rainbow shape, of reproduction. So they're all the same species. Now, what if there was volcanic activity in Northern California? There are volcanoes up there, and it wipes out all of the salamanders in that region. How would this event affect the species Ensatina? So here's our map again, and we've got this series of our salamanders. The red can reproduce with the orange, as shown by this teal. The orange can reproduce with the purple, can reproduce with the yellow, can reproduce with the green, because pink, unidentified population 8, is a hybrid between the green and these yellow and purples. And then green can reproduce with brown, and brown can reproduce with blue from our unidentified population 10. So that's what I mean by this ring. Now, what would happen if something happens in Northern California and wipes out all of those northernmost populations of salamanders? It would break our connection between the coastal and the inland salamanders. They would no longer be able to reproduce with each other naturally because they can't get across that valley where there are no salamanders. So, with the coastal salamanders being separated from the inland salamanders, they would actually be a separate species. So, this shows a cause of speciation. Usually some sort of isolation has to occur. So, if in the future there is volcanic activity, that could lead to our isolation. That would be an example of geographic isolation, some sort of geographic barrier coming between the populations. It could be a river, it could be mountains, it could be an ocean, it could be a desert, anything where the organisms cannot survive or they will not cross to go reproduce with other populations. There are other causes of speciation. It could be reproductive isolation, that different courtship behaviors or timing or physically not being able to reproduce. So this picture here is actually the reproductive organs of barnacles, and you can see they're all shaped very differently. So different populations of barnacles physically cannot reproduce with other populations. So all of these are causes of speciation, and that would lead to a new species arising.